recording now. So good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is for you right now. Thank you to all of those who are tuning in to the first of 2 November Outspoken discussion series events that are organized by Incest AWARE. And today we are welcoming a really remarkable writer and groundbreaker, Laura Davis, who many of us may recognize right off the bat as one of the 2 authors of her book, The Courage to Heal, A Guide for Women Survivors of Child Sexual Abuse. I'm Suzanne Izasa. I'm the founder and co-director of Incest AWARE. I'm also a father-daughter incest survivor, and I've been advocating for a decade now for awareness and action on the topic of incest abuse. So these outspoken talks are designed to help create community among us, raise awareness, learning, and all of these are hosted by Incest AWARE. And we're really excited because we just celebrated our first anniversary. This is being recorded in November of 2021. And last month was our first year anniversary. So it's an exciting moment for us. Incest AWARE is all about ending incest abuse, elevating awareness, and supporting survivors. And we want all survivors of child sexual abuse to be heard, to be believed, and supported. So for those of you who want to know more about us, our website is incestaware.org. If you want to stay informed, you can sign up for e-news on our website, connect with our Facebook group, which is called Incest AWARE. We would really love to get to know you. So please connect with us if you like. So in today's session, we are going to be talking with author and teacher Laura Davis on a really pertinent topic for many of us, especially those of us who are survivors of incest, and that's navigating family relationships after incest abuse, which is a really deeply difficult and personal journey. And I'm joined for this discussion by my co-director at Incest AWARE, the author and activist, Anne M. Loren, who is just as passionate about this issue as I am. So welcome, Anne.
Thanks so much for having me, Suzanne. It's really an honor to be here.
And now our guest speaker. So let's get her voice in here. Laura Davis is the author of 7 groundbreaking books, including The Courage to Heal. And in addition to writing books that inspire, the work of Laura's heart is to teach. She helps people tell their stories and hone their craft. Laura loves creating supportive, intimate writing communities online, in person, and internationally. She's everywhere. And you can read the first 5 chapters of her new memoir, The Burning Light of 2 Stars, at lauradavis.net/chapters. And today is her launch. And so you can actually get the book live and in person. And so that's very exciting that we're doing this on her publication day. So welcome, Laura.
Thank you. And congratulations on the 1-year anniversary. I didn't know that. It's fantastic what you're doing.
Oh, thank you. It has been such a year. It has been such a year. A great year. Great year. So Laura, let's dive right in. So although many of us have gotten to know you by reading your book, which is really famous. And I have to say, I have told so many people about this book, The Courage to Heal, because it was so helpful for me with my own healing. And so you have been on the front lines of, survivor healing and storytelling for years. So when you began your career, was this the path that you envisioned yourself taking? I mean, how did you come to be known as one of these groundbreaking authors on the topic of child sexual abuse healing?
I had absolutely no idea that this would be my trajectory in life. Although it's really interesting. After my mother died, there was a bunch of letters that I found, this correspondence the 2 of us had for many years. And in those letters, I was quite young, and I talked about wanting to be a writer. Like I was in my 20s, my early 20s. I want to be a writer when I grow up. So that was kind of amazing. So I think I always wanted to write, but that's really all I knew. And I had always used words both on a personal level, like as a way to know what I was feeling, to know what I was thinking, to make decisions, to weigh alternatives, to find out my emotions, to vent to express my rage, to proclaim what I was going to fight for in my life. And then I used words also publicly as a way to provoke, to entertain, to inspire. So I always had this relationship with words that had both the internal experience of really using them as a healing tool, a real healing modality, and also using words publicly as a way to educate, to communicate. So I was writing before The Courage to Heal. I was like a news reporter, which I really didn't like the news, but I was a feature writer. I was a talk show host on the radio. And so I was writing lots of short pieces. And The Courage to Heal came about because when I moved to Santa Cruz, California, when I was 23, the very day I moved there, I went to do some laundry in a laundromat, and on the laundromat wall was this like 8.5 by 11 mimeographed, this is how long ago it was, poster. And it said writing workshops with Ellen Bass. And it was called Writing About Our Lives. And I just thought, well, that sounds like that's for me. And so I called the number on, it was like one of those things that have the little tear offs at the bottom. I tore it off and I called, and Ellen welcomed me. And that very weekend, I went to a writing workshop with her and spent a couple years in her writing classes. And then I left, I continued writing, we became friends. And a few years after that was when I began to have my incest memories. I had, forgotten the abuse, I had repressed it. And when I was 27, in the context of really my first serious love relationship, where I was for the first time combining sexuality and intimacy, these memories of abuse by my grandfather started to come up. And I was just, well, I'm sure you all know, I was just completely devastated and felt like my life was being destroyed. Didn't know if I could ever recover from it. And at about that time, I found out from Ellen that she had published a book called I Never Told Anyone, which was the first book of women's stories of having been sexually abused. And Harper and Row had published it, and the book was doing really well. And it was really the first. It was such a groundbreaking book, and they wanted her to write a sequel about healing, and that was the derivation of The Courage to Heal. And we became partners in that project. And it took us, I don't know, 3.5 years from the time we started until the book was published. I mostly did tons of interviews with survivors, and often I was interviewing them. I was not subjective, I'm not objective. I would be interviewing them about whatever I was dealing with in my own healing process. If I was struggling with my mother, I'd ask about their relationship with their mothers. If I was feeling broken sexually, I would ask them about their sexual healing. And it was really the wisdom of the survivors that was the backbone of that book. But I just had no idea that I would go on that trajectory. And even when the book was almost published, I was convinced it would not get published, that our publisher would read it and they would just say it was too radical and that they would reject it. But instead they published it, and it just was passed like woman to woman and therapist to client. And it just became this underground phenomenon because I think women were ready, and not just women, many men used the book. Survivors were ready for something that would be hopeful, for something that would guide them and not just tell them that they were damaged. And our book just lit a spark. It was like being, I guess, in the right place at the right time. And it launched me on this trajectory of being on the road and giving speeches about being a survivor. And suddenly I was, quote unquote, famous for the worst thing that had ever happened to me. So it was and I was only 31 years old. So it was a confusing time. It was exhilarating. I felt incredibly honored to be able to be of service in that way, but I didn't quite have the emotional and spiritual maturity to be able to handle the level of attention that I was getting. I think that's what I want to say about how I ended up in that position.
Yeah, I didn't realize that you were so young at the time that you were writing the book. And it sounds like there was a lot of therapeutic benefit as you were going through the process and talking with people. You're really healing alongside them. And that's so beautiful to hear, because I think sometimes we see, people who are groundbreakers and writers and advocates as being sort of, above it all, as being healed, having everything together. And it's just really a relief sometimes to hear that we're all in the same journey, together. And so from then till now, you have a new book, The Burning Light of Two Stars. And so when we think about the past with the courage to heal, why did you decide to write this book so many years later? What was the impetus for it?
Well, I think of this, the other books I've written, I've written 6 other books, and they all were more like informational, like this is how to do, I wrote 4 books on healing from sexual abuse. And then I just got to a point where, and I think probably some of you can understand this, that I didn't want my whole life identified with being an incest survivor. It was what I was dealing with in my therapy. I was grappling with it in my relationships, and it was all I was doing for my work. And it was how people knew me. And I finally got to a point where I had gotten enough traction in my own healing that I wanted to see who I could be without it all being as a result of being a survivor. And so I actually walked away from, when I was the most successful with the book. I just left it behind because I wanted to find out what else I could do with my life, and who else I could be, and maybe who I would have been if the abuse had never even happened to me. And so I wanted to crack my life open, and it was really scary to walk away from this success I'd had, but it was kind of an odd kind of success because of what it was about. And I just didn't want to be identified with it anymore. I wanted to move on in my own life. And so I did that. And there was a period of time where I just kind of stepped into this void of not knowing what was going to be next. And then I ended up having a family. I met my partner, Karen, who I've been with for over 30 years. She already had a son. We had 2 more children, and that's something I had really wanted. But there was a period when I was really dealing with the heat of my sexual abuse that I was convinced that I was too damaged, to have a family. But as I healed, I felt like I could, and I did. And I was really able to break the cycle with them. So I didn't write about sexual abuse for many years, but what I began to deal with after a number of years of healing was considering whether I wanted to try to renew ties and see if there's any way possible to mend or re-engage with my mother, who had denied that the abuse had ever happened. And so I got very interested in that, and the whole idea of reconciliation, when it is possible and when it isn't possible. And this new book really tracks the history of that kind of intense lifelong relationship with my mother, goes from my birth until her death. And one of the questions I'm really asking in it mostly takes place in her final years, is could I become a caregiver for someone who had betrayed me in the past? That's the question I was exploring, and that's what I was writing about. And I think it's a very individual, personal question. What I did is not necessarily right for anyone else, but as I began to tell the story of that relationship, I had to tell the story of the incest all over again, because otherwise people wouldn't understand how we became so deeply estranged. And that was really where the story started. So this is kind of like, I would say, a prequel and a sequel to The Courage to Heal. And sexual abuse is in the background of the story, but it's not in the foreground.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. It was such a privilege to read the book. Something that I really noticed as a father-daughter incest survivor was just that incest is never just the perpetrator and the victim. It's always a culture. It happens because of family dynamics, which makes the reconciliation process and or the participation process in family environments that much more complex. Can you tell us a little bit about how that manifested in your own family system? I remember a particular story in your book that you're welcome to read if you'd like, about your grandfather and this tradition that your family had.
Yeah, so this is a story that I want to read from the book, and I think it gives a sense of the culture of my family and the culture of denial that was there. And what's weird about this is that my mother's whole side of the family denied that my grandfather was a sexual perpetrator and that there could have been any incest. And yet this scene, which I'm about to read you, is something everyone readily acknowledged. So it's just kind of the weird things that get normalized in a family. And this takes place, the memoir moves through time a lot. It moves through, the present of the story is when I was taking care of my mother at the end of her life. So I'm in my 50s and she's in her 80s. But it also goes backwards in time. And this scene takes place when I'm 14 years old and my mother is 43. The summer of 1971, my breasts grew overnight and I didn't know what to do with them. I covered them with baggy shirts, but they rose like mountains anyway. When I walked down the street, cars slowed, men whistled. I was propositioned all the time. 2 years earlier, I was certain I'd be flat-chested forever. I begged Mom to get me one of those white frilly AA bras that the other undeveloped girls wore, but she didn't believe in training bras. You've got nothing to put in them. You're flat as a pancake. Then, suddenly, in 2 months, my breasts ballooned past triple D. I hunched my shoulders in a vain attempt to hide my chest. My blonde hair, which had always been straight, transformed into a wavy curtain. I parted it in the middle and let it drape straight down to cover my blackheads and the hard tan polka dots of Clearasil that peppered my face. Midway through the summer, Mom and I drove to New York to see Bubby and Papa. That's what we called my grandparents. It was just the two of us. At 14, I still had no conscious memory of my grandfather's abuse, but other things about him made me drag my heels that day. I was dreading a ritual that had long been practiced in my family. As all the girls, Mom, her sisters, and all the girl cousins before me reached adolescence, Papa insisted they lift their shirts and bare their budding breasts for his inspection. It was a rite of passage, a family tradition. After Papa unlocked the deadbolts and the chain, we entered the dark apartment. There were the familiar sepia photos from the old country, a Yiddish newspaper strewn on a chair, the sizzling smell of latkes. Papa took in my new chest and chuckled with delight. Are they growing yet? I shrank away from my body until I could no longer feel the sticky summer heat on my skin, just a cool, empty place inside. Mom looked at me expectantly. Papa waited for me to comply. Let me see, just a little peek. He said it lightly. Wasn't this all just an amusing little joke? I fingered the hem of my white peasant shirt. The embroidery on top was turquoise, green, and gold. They were looking at me, waiting. Papa's eyes gleamed with anticipation. No, the word ignited from somewhere deep inside me. Mom's face hardened. Lori, what's the big deal? Do you have to be so unpleasant? We all did it. I pulled the bottom of my shirt over my jeans. The words tumbled out of an unfamiliar place. I don't want to. Mom's eyes flared with anger and her shoulders squared. Don't be so uptight, Lori. It will only take a minute. She looked at me appraisingly, as she had so many times before. You have a lovely figure. You have nothing to be ashamed of. That's where the memory ends. The only thing I know for sure is that I didn't lift up my shirt and that I was the only girl in the family ever to refuse. Sometimes when I think back to this moment, I imagine it happening at another time of year, with our whole family crammed into that tiny apartment, at a Seder maybe. In that version, I see my teenage self standing up to all of them, every one of my aunts and cousins, all the women and girls, the ones from the past and the ones from the future, all the Ross women, generations of them, shouting, "Why are you making such a big deal about all this? We did it." A whole chorus of shirt lifters clamoring for me to bare my chest. Just one look. Give the dirty old man one look. But I didn't listen to any of them. Not the ones who were there, not the ones in my head. A kernel of resistance rose up inside me. I said no. It would be years before I'd remember what happened with Papa when I was small. But someone fierce woke up inside me that day. She soon dropped back into slumber, but she was there.
Wow, that was so powerful. I read those words and was so moved by them, but hearing you read it is next level. So thank you so much. I love that ending about the real push and pull in survivors' bodies and experiences around resistance and reconciliation when it comes to relationships with family. And something I've loved in your own work and your own commitment to the survivor community is that you've been so vulnerable, especially in this book, about your desire and interest and story about reconciling with your mother. And yet there's so many other survivors like myself who have chosen to cut family ties and or whose relationships with their family are reflected in all sorts of ways in their lives. So as a survivor yourself and as someone who really supports this community, how do you go about holding your story and the kind of resistance versus reconciliation narratives of other survivors in tandem? I know you wrote that beautiful special note in the book about survivors, which you're welcome to read if you want to.
Yeah, for me, it is really essential to stress that the experience that I had with my mother is unique to the two of us. And my mother was really challenging in some ways, and she also had some really good qualities. And she was willing to work from her side towards this reconciliation, and I wanted to work on it from my side. And it was a choice that both of us made. And for me, that choice only came after a hell of a lot of separation, anger, grief, and healing on my part. But I really want to stress that for many people, the best choice is not to reconcile. I mean, not to reconcile in any kind of direct way, because you're dealing with a really toxic relationship. So at the end of my whole story, I did put a little note. And I do want to read that paragraph. A special note to those of you dealing with a painful estrangement. My mother and I achieved real success in our reconciliation, yet I want to caution you against using us as a model for what you should be able to achieve in your own life. Sorry. Some of you may long for reconciliation. Others may be certain you don't want a relationship with the person or people you're estranged from, that your best course of action is to maintain firm boundaries and focused on the best life you can without them. Each situation is different, and there are circumstances in which keeping an abusive or toxic person out of your life is the wisest, healthiest choice, despite strong pressure internally and externally to do otherwise. You should never sacrifice your own well-being to maintain a psychologically devastating relationship. So, I felt like I really wanted to say that to people, because I did not want people to read this book and then to say, well, Laura Davis says we have to try to reconcile with our families. No, you don't. It's really a choice you get to make. I think one thing I want to say is that if you had talked to me when I was 27 or 28 and told me that I would be at my mother's deathbed and that I would want to be there, I would have looked at you like you were like utterly, utterly insane. So, in my experience, what I experienced was that things changed in ways that I never could have anticipated. But that doesn't mean that's going to be the case for someone else.
I remember when first opening it, I was worried as someone who actively chooses not to reconcile, that it would change my mind. And I really felt resistance to read it because of that. And then I was so relieved when I read that paragraph you just read, to know like this is an invitation to get to know Laura's journey and another survivor, and to understand what she chose. And I will feel out kind of throughout the book how I'm feeling and what I'm thinking in relation to my own family. And I was pleasantly surprised to learn throughout the process that it really helped me to kind of understand and empathize and have compassion for the story you presented. But then it also actually validated like my own choices. And then at some points kind of opened me up to being open to like, it's almost like I had these like visions of like how I could possibly reach out in the future in very particular contexts that I currently might feel open to. So it was really healing to read it as even someone who has chosen to relate to her family in a really different way.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing is, I chose what you're choosing for a long time. And I just think I really want to stress that, because, what I remember from when I was first dealing with the sexual abuse is that I got a lot of pressure from the outside, from my relatives, like either it didn't happen, or if it did happen, it happened a long time ago. So just move on, let go of it, just forgive. So, we could all go back to whatever. And I really resented it, and I resisted it. Successfully. I resisted that pressure, but I just remember feeling that pressure, and at the same time feeling like I had to create these boundaries. They were essential to my well-being, and yet I was really deeply grieving for the relationships I'd lost, dysfunctional as they were. So it was so complicated. The whole thing was complex. So I had to set the boundaries, and like with my mother, I missed her. I wouldn't have admitted at the time, but I missed her. And just sometimes you just, I remember at one point I made in therapy, and I had to do this actually for the memoir as well with my writing coach, but I made a list of the good things in my family that I had gotten and a list of the bad things. And the bad list, of course, was much easier to write. And then when I wrote the other list, I was shocked. I thought there'd be nothing on it, but I actually was shocked by how much was on it. And I remember a man I interviewed once, and he said, it's so hard to talk about the violence and the tenderness in my family because there was so much of both. And, I know that's not always the case either. Sometimes it's just horrible, unremittingly horrible. And sometimes it's even more challenging when there's the parts we miss and where we felt connected. And then there's all the horrible things, and there's just kind of, just like that man said, it's hard to speak about because there was so much of both.
I think that's one of the things that's so challenging about being an incest abuse survivor, myself being a father-daughter incest survivor, is that the push and the pull between loving people who have either abused you or participated or enabled the abuse, and really wanting to maintain aspects of the relationships that, we've loved and we actually cherish. I mean, oftentimes, particularly domestic violence survivors, will say, oh, you know, he or she wasn't all bad. They were actually a really good person. They had some really wonderful qualities. And I think I hear this a lot from survivors too. I think it makes the reconciliation process, or I should say the decision making around it, so challenging, because there is such that deep push and pull. And so I'm wondering, Laura, you know, for incest abuse survivors, you know, people here listening as you're talking, or anyone out there who's considering rebuilding a relationship with family, what would you, having gone through this, what would you recommend we think about as we take these steps? What actions would you recommend? You know, how can we keep ourselves safe? How can we keep ourselves in control of this process moving forward, so it's a positive process?
I don't think you could guarantee it being a positive process. I think we could do our best to control what we can control, but when you're dealing with other people, you can't control what they're going to do. But I think what's really important is to evaluate, first look at the family you have and the people you're talking about. And I know in my family, I thought of them as like a conglomerate, my family. But then when I actually looked at individuals, there were a few individuals who actually had been supportive of me, and others who were, you know, devastatingly not supportive. And I started trying to work on developing different relationships with different people. That was helpful. And I think the other thing is that one of our jobs when we're healing is to learn what a healthy family is like. And to learn what love in a family should be like, because I think it's easy to get trapped into when all we've known, when the word love, I love you, is coupled with, you know, abuse or violation or turning the other way or not being protected, we get a really warped idea of what is healthy. So I think that was something I learned in therapy, and I learned by observation of other people what a healthy family could be like. And that helped me assess better the family I did have. And I think there's, for me, I had to really not experiment with dealing with my family from a place of like desperate need or desperate hunger. I had to really kind of heal to the point that I felt more whole, and then I was able to do some experimentation. And I think, you know, like there are certain things in family sometimes, like there's an expectation that if you go for a visit, you're going to stay with your parents, for instance, and you're going to come for a week. Well, it might be that, first of all, you decide you're not going to visit in person, and that your only contact might be on the phone or, you know, digitally, or something that has a lot more distance. Or you might decide, you know, I'm going to come, but I'm going to stay somewhere else, and I'm only coming over for 2 hours, and I'm bringing someone with me. So there's ways to experiment with kind of, is there a level at which the relationship is successful? And what is that? I remember there was this one woman I interviewed for Courage to Heal many years ago, and her story stuck out to me because it was similar to mine. She said that her mother, she would go see her mother, and within, you know, the first 2 hours would be like the honeymoon period. It would be good. And then the whole visit would disintegrate, and they'd end up yelling and screaming at each other, and she would feel devastated, and she would go like hide in the closet and just be devastated. And then she would go home, and it would take her months to recover. And in the meantime, she and her mother were writing to each other, and they wrote really nice letters to each other. And so they would start corresponding again. And after a number of months of that, she'd think, well, maybe I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't so bad. Maybe I'll go see my mother again. And she would go back, and the same cycle would repeat. And it repeated over and over and over. And finally, she said, I just got up one day and I realized that I'm not going to go see my mother anymore, that the only mother I have is a mother in letters. And that always stood out to me. Like, she figured out that at that level of kind of a superficial, distant relationship, she was able to have some kind of contact. And for many other people, what's really needed is a healing separation, and really establishing boundaries and establishing the kind of support system that you need that you're not getting from your family. And I think it's only from that point that you can begin to explore the possibility of initiating any kind of contact. So I think there's, and I remember every time I would have any outreach with my family, I would explore it. I would go back, I was in therapy, I would go back to therapy, and it would give me like grist for the mill. It would give me something to work on. And I would evaluate what had happened and decide whether I wanted to take another small step or whether retreating and creating more distance was a better option.
Wow. So some of the themes that I'm hearing you say is boundaries, taking things slowly, really putting some thought into how we are going to do this process, who we have behind us, supporting us through this process. And so I think that's so affirming because, you know, I think many times we want to jump into things, we feel that pull and we want to jump in, but actually slowing down and conscientiously thinking through how are we going to do this can keep us safe. I love how you drew those pieces out. Thanks.
I think also, you know, there's different types of what we're calling reconciliation. And I think that we often think about this kind of like full on thing where the perpetrator or the person who's wronged us is completely accountable. They apologize, they make amends, and then we consider whether or not we want to engage with them or not. And that's actually pretty rare. I mean, I have seen it happen. I think it's pretty rare. But then there are other scenarios where we agree to disagree. I did that with my mother. Or let's say you're in a family constellation and you really want to go to your sister's wedding, and you know that the perpetrator is going to be there, or someone else that you are having a hard time with is going to be there, and you have to decide whether to go or not. And it may be possible with a skilled mediator to come up with some like rules of engagement, which might be that you could say something like, well, I'll come to the wedding, but I am not sitting at the family table, you know, and I'm not going to be anywhere near dad. I'm not taking family pictures. And you are not allowed to talk about my weight, you know, or how difficult I was as a teenager. So I think you could start to set some parameters that may make it possible to be civil in a situation like that. But you never could guarantee that the other people will obey your rules, in which case you have more evidence, more reason to back away. So again, I think it's a lot of trial and error, and you really need a lot of support. And you need to know, I think one thing I always asked myself if I was considering an action is, what is the best outcome that could happen and what is the worst? And the best outcome often was a fantasy based on unrealistic childish desire for something that probably was not possible. And the worst, I had to know that I could live with the worst outcome. And then I would feel like, well, okay, I could take a step forward.
That's such clear advice. And I think our listeners are finding it so helpful. One thing or two things you mentioned and you talk a lot about in the book is this overwhelming sense of grief, and then also the support of the family system you created for yourself. Can you speak a little bit to grief management for really all survivors, not just people who choose to kind of walk away from their families, because we're all managing the grief of not having had supportive or safe family systems, regardless of whether or not we reconcile or in what capacities. And then the steps that you took in order to build a family system, whether that's kind of a nuclear family system with a partner and children, and or a family system of friends.
Yeah, I built both of those. I mean, first I built the family system of friends, and those people that I connected with at that time in my life are still my closest friends, you know, almost 40 years later. So those bonds of people who were there for me at that terrible time in my life when most of my family was not, were very significant to me and have remained that way. So for me, that was really important. And I did also, I had, friends who were also survivors, and that was really important to me because they understood without me having to explain what I was going through and what I was feeling. And in terms of the nuclear family I formed, I feel like I got lucky. My partner Karen, I think, has really been an incredibly grounding force. She also was abused as a child, not sexually abused, but came from a very violent alcoholic home. So we both have had to do a lot of healing. We both had done a lot of healing before we met each other. And I think in our case, I think both of us, we do family really well together. We were good parents together. We matched each other. And I think our kids grew up with no trauma, which is, I've published all these books, I've done all these things, but having children who their core is intact and they're now young adults feels like such an incredible triumph. I feel really lucky. And also, like, we worked really hard. I worked really hard to be able to do that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, I love that so much. Just hearing you say the words, we do family well together, brings up so many memories in my own life of the family system that I built, and made me tingle. So thank you so much. You were talking earlier about this kind of duplicity in incest survivor family systems, where there is such horror, like you having to bare your breasts in front of your grandfather and whole family, but then also this real tenderness, and that you had kind of a longing and you missed your mother. And that's one of the reasons why you desired to reconcile and then share this story. There was a really vivid scene about you going out in the rain that I would love you to share, to kind of give the audience a sense of that other side of your mother's you and your mother's relationship.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting, the precursor to this scene that I'm going to read to you is that when I wrote a book called I Thought We'd Never Speak Again about 20 years ago, and it was the first book I wrote about reconciliation, and it was more of a how-to book, like how to reconcile. These are the situations in which it's possible. This is when it's not possible. Here are other ways you could find resolution, even if it can't be directly with your family members. And that story had like a little thread of the story of my mother and me and what we went through, which is now, expanded into a whole book. So it wasn't very much. I would call it like this, like it's just woven through. But I didn't want that book I had written to lead to another estrangement between me and my mother, because we were in a pretty decent place at the time that book came out. It inspired me to write the book. And so at the end, when the book was almost finished, I had a contract, I had a publisher, I knew the book was coming out. I gave it to my mother to read because I didn't want there to be anything in there that would just set us back. I didn't want it to be moving us in the wrong direction. And during the month she read it, I was just like sweating it out really badly. This is one of the stories I tell. And ultimately, and I said to her, let me know if there's anything you can't live with. That was my criterion. It wasn't like, you don't like this word or you don't like this, but tell me if there's something you can't live with. And in the end, there were just two things that she asked for. And one of them was, I'd like you to say more good things about me. And that just about broke my heart, because what I realized, and this is something that I really explore in depth, is that my mother is a really complex woman. She had a lot of very difficult qualities. And for many, many years, I just portrayed her as an ogre. I used to imagine her as like a spider trying to get me in her web to devour me. That's how I felt about her. And by the time she asked this question, many years had passed, and I realized that she also had some really good qualities. And there were some aspects in which she actually had been a good mother to me, even though there were some aspects in which she really, really failed me. But that I had really held her failures. They were like set in stone to me, and her good qualities I didn't even pay attention to. And so when she asked me to write something good about her, I really felt this grief that I had not noticed the positive qualities. And so I did write this story. This is one of the good things that I added to the book after she made that request. Here's one. It happened in New Jersey when Mom was still living in my childhood home. I was visiting from far away. I imagined myself in my early 20s. Maybe it was after I left the ashram at 21, when I had no idea what the rest of my life might be. Perhaps it was after I came out to her, when I was on my high horse spouting feminist philosophy, and she was certain I'd live out my life as a lonely lesbian in a seedy bar. The night before, Mom and I had agreed to call a truce on whatever conflagration was consuming us and to walk to the beach the next morning. After breakfast, we put on our windbreakers, laced up our sneakers, and headed out the front door toward the Atlantic. The moment we stepped out onto the crooked sidewalk, the sky opened as if God had decided that very day to start the flood. Sunny one moment, a downpour the next. I gasped. She gasped. We were drenched in seconds, rain soaking our clothes, dripping from our noses, saturating our skin. Our socks and shoes, soggy white cotton in rubber soles. Mom yelled out, "It's raining, cats and dogs." I nodded, but could barely hear her. The rain was too loud. We looked at each other, each expecting the other to run back into the shelter of the house. Mom shouted through the rain, "Let's go anyway." As she looked at me expectantly, a huge, adventurous grin spread across her face. I'd never seen that look before. Her hair was stringy and wet, her cheeks painted with rivulets of rain, her dare unmistakable. I wanted to know this woman. "Yes," I shouted, grinning back. She put her arm in mine and it felt like it belonged there, and together we turned away from the known world and the walls of my childhood home and ran out onto the soggy streets, our glasses streaked so much we couldn't see. Laughing, delighted, we strode out into the deluge. I
Oh,
think
that I just want to say that is so beautiful. I think that's such a fitting way to begin to wrap up our discussion. I have really loved reading your book. For anyone who's listening, absolutely highly, of course, recommend it. And like Anne was saying earlier, you don't have to be in a certain place in your life, whether you're estranged or you're reconciled. You don't need to be in any specific place. There's so much learning, and there's so many ways to personalize your story for ourselves. And I felt that reading it. I felt that push and pull that Anne was describing earlier about, what is it like to be in your shoes, and what can I draw from your experience, from my own life. So I really want to thank you for sharing all of this with us, and for sharing the parts of your book that many of us haven't had the chance to read. But how can we get your book? How can people get you?
Well, if you go to lauradavis.net, www.lauradavis.net, you'll find links to many places to buy the book, both the ebook, the audiobook where I read it, and the paperback. And also you can download the first 5 chapters for free and just read the first 5 chapters, which is, a pretty substantial sample, and then see if you want to get it. So that's where you could find me. I'm on social media too, Facebook at The Writer's Journey. And on Instagram, I'm at Laura Sari, S-A-R-I Davis, at Laura Sari Davis. But website is best, lauradavis.net. And the book is available, wherever books are sold now. It's officially published. So and wherever you normally get your books, you should be able to get it. It's probably not in the libraries yet, but hopefully someday it will be.
Well, thank you. And Anne, I want to give you just a moment to jump in to help me close out here.
Laura, thank you so much. I also wanted to pitch for any writers out there to take Laura's writing classes whenever there's availability. I was one of her, I got to write with her and it was a real privilege. But, we have this, one of our missions as an organization, Incest Aware, is to really teach the media to better represent incest survivor stories. So I just want to thank you so much for representing us so well through the experience of your body. You really honored the complexity of the physiological symptoms, the neurological symptoms, the relational symptoms, the ontological symptoms, like our challenge with identity and family and being and who we are and how we let go and how we don't. It was so beautiful to read so much of the story of my own body in your story. So thank you so much for the cost of that, because I know that wasn't without emotional labor.
No, it was, I suffered writing this book. And I did, it's interesting because you have to pick certain things for your character. And I chose dissociation as one of the ways to track the trajectory of this character, because you want to see how someone changes. And at the beginning, I'm dissociating all the time. And then as the book goes along, I'm capable of becoming more present. And going from a real black and white thinking to something that's more broad.
Wow, well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure to be here.